The rain had been falling since early afternoon, a steady curtain that softened the edges of the small town and filled the streets with the slow rhythm of water against pavement. Inside St. Augustine's Church, the choir rehearsal ran later than usual. The vaulted ceilings carried every note upward, lingering in the air before fading into the quiet moments between songs. 17-year-old Emily Varner sat near the front, her hands resting lightly on her lap as she listened to the last harmonies of the evening. She had been part of the choir since she was 12, known for a voice that could carry through the nave without strain, and for a discipline rare among her peers. That night, she wore the same dark cardigan she often used during colder months, her hair pulled back, her expression thoughtful. Rehearsal ended just after 8, but Emily didn't leave right away. She stayed behind, speaking with the music director about an upcoming solo performance, the details quiet enough that no one else could hear. By the time she stepped outside, the rain had lightened to a mist. Street lamps glowed against the slick sidewalk, and Emily paused to take her phone from her bag. She sent a short text to her father, just one line saying she would walk home, no need for a ride. The distance wasn't far, maybe 15 minutes, a route she had taken dozens of times before. She adjusted the strap of her black cello case, the one she used to carry sheet music and supplies as much as the instrument itself, and set off toward her neighborhood. 2 neighbors later recalled seeing her, both noticing the case more than anything else. It was large, obvious, and slightly awkward to carry in the rain. One saw her passing under the faint orange halo of a streetlight, her head down against the drizzle. The other caught a glimpse from behind a curtain as she turned onto the block where she lived. Neither remembered seeing anyone following her, nor did they hear anything unusual. At home, her parents assumed she'd gone straight to her room after coming in late. It wasn't unusual for Emily to close herself off after a long rehearsal, especially when she had school the next morning. Her father didn't think to knock or check. The first sign that something was wrong came, not in the evening, but the following morning when her mother noticed her bedroom door still closed well past the time Emily should have been getting ready. Inside, the bed was untouched. Her school bag and books were still there, but her phone was missing. A check of the kitchen showed no signs of her having breakfast or even pouring herself a glass of water. Panic didn't set in immediately. At first, there was the faint hope she had gone to a friend's house early, maybe to study before classes. Calls to her friends' phones were met with confusion. None had seen her. By the time the school confirmed she hadn't attended first period and her father confirmed she hadn't slept in her room, the uneasy quiet in the house shifted into something sharper, heavier. They called the police just before noon. The responding officers arrived within half an hour, taking down descriptions and last known sightings. Rain from the night before had likely washed away any footprints or small evidence along her route, making the job harder from the start. The initial thought, a teenager leaving home on her own, didn't quite fit. There were no signs of a packed bag, no withdrawal of money, no message to anyone about leaving. Officers canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking for security footage from nearby businesses. They found no trace of her passing beyond the 2 neighbor accounts. By late afternoon, the search extended into the edges of town. Volunteers from the church and school joined in, combing sidewalks and yards, calling her name. The image of the cello case kept coming up in conversations, a detail impossible to ignore. It wasn't the kind of item you could easily discard or hide. And yet if Emily had been taken, or if she had simply walked away, it was the most conspicuous thing she had with her. Police began asking if anyone had seen it abandoned or in someone else's possession. No one had. That first day ended without answers. Emily's parents sat together in the living room long after the officers left, the sound of rain still faint outside. The house felt colder, emptier, as if the absence of her footsteps had already settled into its walls. Somewhere between the moment she left the church and the moment she should have walked through the front door, she had disappeared entirely. The cello case, the quiet street, the mist in the air. These were the only certainties, and they offered nothing. And as the sun set on that first day, it was becoming clear this was not going to be the kind of mystery that unraveled quickly. By the time the first 24 hours had passed, the investigation into Emily Varner's disappearance had already shifted from concern to urgency. Police treated it as a missing persons case from the moment her parents called, but as hours ticked by without any credible lead, the search began to swell. Detectives interviewed her closest friends at school, most of whom described her as quiet, focused, and dependable. None of them had received texts or calls from her after rehearsal. Her choir peers echoed the same sentiment. Emily wasn't the type to skip town or run away without telling anyone. Church members remembered seeing her during rehearsal, cheerful enough, and a few had even watched her chatting with the music director before she left. No one saw her after she stepped out into the misty night. The first sweep of the neighborhood began with volunteers, parents, students, members of the congregation, walking the streets in small groups, checking alleys, porches, and backyards along her likely route home. Search and rescue dogs were brought in, but the rain from the night before had been steady and unrelenting, washing away most scent trails before they could be picked up. The dogs traced her from the church steps to the first intersection, then lost the trail entirely, as if she had stepped off the street and simply ceased to exist. Officers expanded the search grid, hoping for discarded belongings or any piece of the distinctive black cello case, but nothing surfaced. Local businesses were asked for surveillance footage. The nearest shop's cameras showed her passing by at 8:14 p.m., head down, clutching the strap of the case against her shoulder. Beyond that, the trail went dark. Another camera, mounted 2 blocks away, should have caught her next turn toward home, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished in the space between those 2 points, between the known and the unknown, under the dim glow of streetlights blurred by rain. The absence of footage raised quiet speculation among the investigators. Either she had turned somewhere unexpected, or someone had intercepted her in the narrow, unmonitored stretch of road. Her parents grew increasingly restless, answering the same questions over and over from police, clinging to the hope that a small, overlooked detail might lead to her. They provided every recent photograph they could find, including one from a recent choir performance where the black cello case stood beside her chair. The case became a focal point in the search. It was large, rigid, and not the kind of thing that could be tucked away unnoticed. Detectives believed that finding it could lead directly to Emily, or at the very least, to the last place she had been. Yet days passed, and the case remained as invisible as she was. Flyers were printed and taped to storefronts, bus stops, and lampposts. Social media filled with her image, pushing for tips. Calls came in, each promising a possible sighting. A girl matching her description boarding a late-night bus, a teenager walking along a county road. None of them checked out. The cello case was never mentioned in any of these reports, and that detail alone convinced police that these leads were false. By the third day, the search widened beyond the town limits. Drones scanned wooded areas along possible backroads, and officers checked drainage ditches and isolated properties. A dive team swept the shallow river that ran parallel to her route, finding only debris from recent storms. Detectives began considering scenarios they hadn't wanted to entertain: abduction, concealment, perhaps even that she had been lured into a vehicle. But with no evidence left behind, every theory remained just that, a theory. The volunteers started to thin out by the end of the first week. People returned to their routines, though the absence lingered like a shadow over the community. Her parents kept vigil at home, refusing to leave in case the phone rang. Each evening, as the light faded, they replayed the short sequence of events they knew: rehearsal, the text to her father, the brief sightings by neighbors. Somewhere between those points, something irreversible had happened. Detectives revisited the church multiple times, combing through storage areas, practice rooms, even the choir loft. Nothing of hers was found. The music director, questioned again, insisted that Emily had seemed fine when she left, focused, not upset, giving no indication she felt threatened. Yet something about the abrupt end to her trail unsettled even the most experienced officers. In their words, cases rarely go entirely cold this quickly unless someone made sure it would. As the 10th day closed without discovery, hope began to thin. Police continued to push for tips, but internally, they admitted the trail was dangerously close to gone. The cello case remained their most tangible clue, a conspicuous object that had somehow become invisible. Its absence felt deliberate, as if whoever had taken it knew exactly what it symbolized. Proof that Emily had been there, and proof that she had been carrying something that couldn't simply disappear on its own. And with each day that passed, the space between what was known and what could be proven grew wider, leaving the search team to wonder if they were looking for a missing girl or for a truth someone had worked very hard to bury. In the days following the failed search, the investigation began to turn inward, toward the only place Emily had been known to spend the hours before she vanished: St. Augustine's Church. The choir loft, usually a sanctuary of music and routine, became the center of quiet speculation. As detectives interviewed the members one by one, stories began to surface, not as direct accusations, but as whispers layered with unease. A few recalled moments of tension between Emily and an older bass singer, a man in his 20s who had been part of the group for less than a year. No one claimed to have seen anything inappropriate, but there had been disagreements during rehearsals, sharp exchanges over tempo or phrasing, moments when Emily's usual composure slipped into visible discomfort. Others remembered something different: her growing habit of staying behind after practice to work on a piece alone, a solo arrangement that wasn't part of the choir's repertoire. No one could say where she'd gotten the sheet music or why she'd kept it so private, but the image of her in the empty church, lit by the muted glow of a single lamp, lingered in their minds. To some, it seemed driven by artistic dedication. To others, it felt like she was trying to avoid someone. The choir director was candid during questioning. He admitted he'd noticed changes in her demeanor over the past month: less chatter with her friends, fewer smiles, a tendency to keep her eyes down when certain people entered the room. He had attributed it to stress over school or the upcoming performance, but in hindsight, it seemed heavier, more deliberate. He couldn't recall any one conversation that explained it. When asked about the solo piece she'd been practicing, he claimed he had never heard it and hadn't approved it for any performance. Police expanded their interviews beyond the choir, speaking with regular churchgoers, custodial staff, and parish volunteers. Each account painted a similar picture. Emily was quiet, focused, polite. Nothing anyone said offered a direct lead. No one reported seeing her leave with another person, and no one admitted to following her. The church itself yielded no signs of struggle. Her belongings from rehearsal night had left with her. There was no abandoned music folder or coat, no misplaced personal item to suggest she had intended to return. The absence of physical evidence began to shape the way the case was being viewed. Without signs of force or injury, some investigators entertained the idea that she might have left willingly with someone she knew, perhaps even to meet someone. That possibility, when mentioned to her family, was met with immediate rejection. Emily had never been secretive about where she was going, and there had been no messages on her phone, at least none they were aware of, hinting at a clandestine meeting. Her parents clung to the belief that whatever had happened was against her will. Meanwhile, the media had begun circling the story, each outlet adding its own angle. Some speculated about a secret relationship. Others latched onto the idea of a stalker, weaving in ominous details from unrelated cases. A few tabloids painted her as a mysterious prodigy hiding a double life. None of it sat well with those who knew her, but the noise made it harder for police to separate fact from rumor. Tip lines filled with calls from people certain they'd seen her or convinced they knew who was responsible. Most of these led nowhere. Detectives stayed fixed on the tangible trail, which was already cooling. Surveillance footage ended exactly where it had before. Door-to-door canvassing brought no new witnesses. Even the man she'd reportedly clashed with, the older bass, denied any involvement, insisting their disagreements were purely musical. His alibi for that night, though imperfect, couldn't be definitively broken. The sheet music for her secret solo was nowhere to be found, and without it, the theory that it might have been connected to her disappearance remained just that, a theory. By the second week, the investigative focus on the church was losing momentum. The choir members returned to rehearsals, their voices filling the loft as before, but the atmosphere was different now, measured, cautious, and under the quiet weight of suspicion. Some avoided speaking to the press. Others seemed almost eager to share their version of events, as if talking might distance them from whatever had happened. None could answer the question that mattered most: why a 17-year-old girl would vanish between the comfort of the loft and the safety of her home. For the detectives, the lack of disruption inside the church meant the truth likely waited somewhere beyond its walls. Yet the thin thread of her last hours, there was all they had to follow. And as the days stacked into weeks, each without progress, that thread began to fray, leaving only fragments of memory and a growing uncertainty about whether the story of Emily's disappearance was written in the spaces they had already searched, or in the ones they had yet to imagine. With no body, no clear point of disappearance, and no physical evidence to anchor the case, the investigation into Emily Varner's vanishing began to drift into the unstable territory of possibilities and suspicion. Detectives could no longer follow a trail. They had to follow people. The first to draw their attention was a fellow student from her high school, a quiet boy who, according to classmates, had been infatuated with Emily for months. Friends described him as awkward, prone to watching her from across the cafeteria, and once overheard telling someone he wouldn't let her get away. It was the kind of statement that sounded ominous in hindsight, though at the time it had been dismissed as teenage exaggeration. He admitted to detectives that he liked her, but insisted he had never spoken to her outside of class. On the night she disappeared, he claimed to have been home playing video games. His parents supported the alibi, but with no time-stamped proof, it remained possible, just not provable. The second person of interest was far more complicated. Among the choir's lower bass section was a man in his mid-30s with a criminal history, something the church claimed not to have known when he joined. His record wasn't violent, burglary and possession charges from years earlier, but it was enough to make him stand out. He had been seen talking to Emily during breaks in rehearsal, though others said she never seemed comfortable in his presence. The night of her disappearance, he said he left rehearsal early to meet a friend across town. That friend confirmed they'd met for drinks, but couldn't be sure of the exact time. Surveillance from the bar was incomplete due to a broken camera over the back entrance. His past, his proximity, and the gaps in his story made him an obvious focus, yet nothing connected him directly to Emily after she walked out of the church. The third lead came from a tip in the earliest days of the search, a delivery driver who had been making late-night drop-offs in the area and was reportedly seen near the church around the time Emily left. He was questioned a week later, claiming he'd been on his route and had no memory of seeing her. GPS logs from his company van placed him in the general vicinity, but deliveries could not account for every minute of his schedule. Detectives noted inconsistencies in his timeline, yet without witnesses or physical evidence, they couldn't place him in contact with Emily. Interviews, re-interviews, background checks, each of the three men was examined from every angle. Detectives compared their statements against one another, looking for contradictions that might hint at collusion or deception. None of them knew each other. None of them, on paper, had an obvious reason to make Emily vanish. Yet each existed in that unsettling overlap of possibility and uncertainty. They were close enough to matter, but not close enough to catch. In press conferences, the absence of concrete progress became difficult to disguise. Reporters pressed for updates, demanding names, demanding action. Detectives remained vague, citing the need to protect the integrity of the investigation. They did, however, keep returning to the same visual: the black cello case Emily had been carrying. Its size, its uniqueness, its sheer inconvenience made it impossible to ignore. They spoke about it as if it were a key, something that, once found, would unlock the rest of the mystery. But its continued absence created an almost symbolic weight. Every mention of it reminded the public of the case's central frustration, an object too large to hide easily, and yet, like Emily herself, invisible. Behind closed doors, investigators admitted what they rarely voiced to the media. The case felt like chasing fog. Every potential suspect came with holes in their story, but no one broke under pressure. Every possible lead led back to that silent stretch of street between the two surveillance cameras, the point where she was last seen walking alone. Theories were tested, then discarded. Maybe she'd been coaxed into a car she trusted. Maybe she had stepped into a side alley to avoid someone and never reappeared. Maybe the cello case itself had been the reason she was targeted. Weeks passed, and none of the three men faced charges. They remained under quiet surveillance, their movements noted, their histories re-examined whenever new technology or resources became available. Still, there was no break. Emily's family watched from the sidelines as the focus shifted from an urgent hunt for their daughter to a pattern of interviews and re-interviews that produced no answers. For them, it was agonizing to hear speculation that she might have left on her own, a theory the lack of struggle seemed to invite. But in their minds, Emily's disappearance was not voluntary, and the cello case, still missing, was proof that someone had taken her. By the end of that year, the case was stalled. The three names floated quietly in the background of police files, not forgotten, but without enough to push forward. The cello case remained a talking point in every anniversary article and late-night discussion, a conspicuous piece of evidence that had never been found and could not be explained away. And while detectives could not prove that any of the three men had crossed paths with Emily that night, they also could not prove they hadn't, which meant the question of who had taken her and why stayed wide open. As months turned into years, the story of Emily Varner's disappearance began to recede from the public mind. The urgency that had once driven nightly news segments and daily searches slowly gave way to the quieter rhythm of unsolved cases. For a while, her name still surfaced in true crime blogs and on local message boards, often alongside speculation, half-remembered rumors, or elaborate amateur theories. In the neighborhood where she vanished, the memory lingered a little longer. People still glanced down the street where she was last seen, still remembered the rain that night, still recalled the black cello case no one ever found. But time eroded the sharp edges of their recollection. New stories replaced old ones. New faces moved into the houses along her route. For her parents, the weight of absence never lessened. 2 years after the search had gone cold, they sold the family home. It wasn't just the street itself that had become unbearable. It was the grocery store where her face had once been taped to the window, the sidewalks she should have walked, the church whose doors she had left for the final time. They moved 2 towns over, chasing some distance from the unchanging questions that haunted them. In the years that followed, they learned how to live with the silence, though it never stopped pressing in. They avoided interviews. They declined most anniversary coverage. To them, Emily's story had been reduced to a handful of facts repeated in headlines, stripped of the girl they knew. Detectives rotated in and out of the case file over the years. Some brought fresh eyes, others simply inherited it as one of many cold cases sitting in storage. Every so often, there would be a burst of activity, an old lead revisited, a new forensic technique tried, but it never lasted. Without physical evidence to test, there was little for technology to improve. The original binders of reports, photos, and interview transcripts collected dust on a shelf in the station, their edges yellowing, their weight unchanged. From time to time, possible sightings reignited a flicker of hope. A bus passenger in another state claimed to have seen a girl with Emily's eyes, traveling alone and looking nervous. A man swore he'd watched a young woman playing cello at a community college recital who bore an uncanny resemblance to her. Each tip was investigated, each unraveling under scrutiny. The bus footage was grainy and inconclusive, the passenger's memory unreliable. The young cellist had a different name, a different history, and no connection to St. Augustine's Church. Every near miss left the family raw, each one another reminder of how easily hope could be raised and then broken. By the time the 15th anniversary approached, the case had settled into a kind of ghostly existence. It lived on in the minds of a few, retired officers who still wondered about the gaps they never closed, true, crime enthusiasts who built timelines and maps on internet forums, neighbors who remembered her walking past with that large case on her back. But in the broader world, her disappearance had become one of countless unsolved mysteries, troubling, unsatisfying, and quietly fading. The cello case was still mentioned in passing, always as the most visible piece of a puzzle no one had solved. Its absence had taken on a strange symbolic weight, a missing object inside a missing story. It was in the late summer of that 15th year, when the case seemed destined to remain undisturbed, that something shifted. Not in the investigation, but in the building where Emily had last been seen. St. Augustine's Church announced it would be undergoing extensive renovations. The roof needed replacing, the sanctuary needed restoration, and most notably, the basement and storage rooms, some of which had not been opened in years, were to be cleared entirely. The announcement barely registered outside the congregation. It was mentioned once in the local paper, buried between community calendar notices and a report on road repairs. But for those who remembered Emily's final steps, the news struck a quiet chord. The church was the place she had walked out of into the rain, the place she had lingered for private practice, the place where whispers about her had started in the days after she vanished. Now its deepest, most forgotten spaces were about to be emptied. Few could say exactly what they hoped might be found: an overlooked note, a personal belonging, perhaps even the long-missing cello case. Most assumed nothing would come of it. After all, if there had been something to discover, surely it would have been found years ago. Still, in the quiet corners of the community, and in the minds of those who had never truly stopped thinking about her, the announcement stirred something difficult to name. The renovations were scheduled to begin in the fall, and for the first time in years, there was the faint, almost reluctant thought that maybe, somewhere in those untouched rooms, there was still a piece of Emily Varner waiting to be uncovered. The first weeks of the church renovations passed quietly. Pews were moved, scaffolding went up, and the smell of fresh lumber and old dust began to fill the air. In early October, the work shifted to the basement, a sprawling, low-ceilinged space beneath the main hall that had been used for decades to store everything from holiday decorations to unused furniture. Few people had reason to go down there anymore. Some areas hadn't been touched in over a decade, their shelves sagging under the weight of forgotten boxes. It was in one of those corners, behind a wall of old choir risers and stacks of folding chairs, that two workers spotted it. Wedged tight against the back wall was a black cello case. The leather was dulled with a thick coat of dust, the metal lock flecked with rust. At first, they assumed it was just another piece of abandoned equipment. But as one of them ran his hand over the curved lid, he noticed how heavy it felt, much heavier than an empty case should be. They hauled it out into the open and set it on a work table. The hinges creaked when they tried to open it, but the lock held. A nameplate near the handle was worn nearly smooth, but faint letters could still be seen under the dust, enough to make one of them pause. That same afternoon, the church's music director, now in his early 60s, was called down from his office. He had been there on the night Emily vanished. He recognized the case immediately. His hands lingered on the handle as if confirming it was real. Without hesitation, he called the police before anyone tried to force it open. Officers arrived within the hour, treating the case as potential evidence. Photographs were taken, measurements noted. It was carried upstairs and placed on a clean sheet in the choir loft. A locksmith was brought in to open the corroded lock without damaging the contents. When the lid finally gave way, the interior revealed something eerily out of place in the modern world. A perfectly preserved cello, its wood polished, its strings intact, as if it had been waiting in the dark for all these years. But the officer's attention was quickly drawn to something else. Through the cello's sound hole, something was stuffed deep inside the hollow body. With gloves and delicate tools, they coaxed it free, a cloth bundle, tightly wrapped and bound with string. The fabric was old, stained in places, and it gave off a faint musty smell. No one in the room spoke as an evidence technician began to unroll it. Inside were several small objects, each wrapped again in thin tissue: a silver locket, a set of folded sheet music, and several loose pages that, upon closer inspection, were from a diary. The locket's clasp was tarnished, but when it was opened, it revealed a photograph. Emily, smiling faintly, her hair pulled back, wearing the cardigan she'd been last seen in. The sheet music appeared to be for a solo arrangement, with handwritten notes scrawled in the margins. Some were instructions, phrasing marks, tempo changes, but others were less conventional. Short phrases, single words, a few underlined multiple times. The handwriting was neat, but not hers. The diary pages, dated in the weeks before she disappeared, carried a different weight. One entry mentioned her being nervous about walking home lately. Another noted, "Someone knows my songs," followed by a line that had been scratched out so hard it tore the paper. By the time the evidence was bagged and taken from the church, word had begun to spread. In a town where the case had long since faded into a sad piece of history, this discovery landed like a sudden storm. Neighbors called each other, social media filled with speculation, and old theories resurfaced. For the first time in years, the Varner family received a call from detectives, not to mark another anniversary, but to tell them something tangible had been found. The reopening of the case was immediate. The items from the cello were sent for forensic testing. The locket was swabbed for DNA, the sheet music examined for fingerprints, the diary pages scanned and preserved. Detectives began retracing old steps, contacting previous suspects, revisiting witness statements, and searching for any overlooked connections between the objects and the people who had last been near Emily. The church basement was searched top to bottom, every shelf and corner examined in case the case's placement had been deliberate concealment rather than accidental neglect. For those who had lived through the original search, the shock was less about the cello itself and more about where it had been. The basement was part of the initial investigation, yet somehow this case, large, distinct, unmistakable, had gone unnoticed or unrecorded. Whether it had been hidden later or simply overlooked remained an open question, but one thing was certain. It had been there for a long time, sealed and silent, holding fragments of the girl who had vanished into the rain 15 years earlier. And now, those fragments were in the hands of investigators, pieces of a story that might finally have a chance of being told. The bundle recovered from inside the cello was transferred to the state crime lab under strict chain of custody protocol, every step documented as if it might one day need to stand before a jury. Technicians began the painstaking process of separating each piece from the decades-old fabric, photographing it from multiple angles before carefully sealing it in its own evidence bag. The first item, the silver locket, was small and worn but immediately recognizable to those who had known Emily. Her mother later confirmed it had been a gift from her grandmother, something she had worn often but almost never taken off. When the lab results came back, the DNA swab from the inner clasp matched Emily's profile exactly, confirming beyond any doubt that the cello and its contents had been in her possession in the days leading up to her disappearance. The second item, a set of folded sheet music, was for a piece no one in the choir recognized. It was a haunting solo arrangement for voice and cello, handwritten on aged paper. In the margins, neat but deliberate annotations wound between the staves, musical markings, tempo shifts, and, in certain places, short fragments of text. Some were benign, like reminders to hold here or soften the final note, but others seemed out of place. Single words underlined twice, phrases written in block capitals, one page bearing the cryptic notation, "Not here, wait." The handwriting was compared to samples from Emily's schoolwork and confirmed not to be hers. The fact that someone else had marked her private music raised the question of who had been close enough to her and trusted enough to alter something so personal without her erasing it. The last and perhaps most unsettling items were the diary pages. They were not a full journal, just loose leaves, torn from what must have been a larger book. The earliest page was dated about a month before she vanished. It described nothing unusual: school assignments, a passing comment about the choir being more tense lately. But as the entries moved closer to the night she disappeared, the tone began to shift. A note from 3 weeks before read, "Don't like walking home alone anymore." Another, just 2 weeks before the disappearance, stated, "Someone knows my songs. I don't know how, but they do." Below that line, a sentence had been furiously scratched out, the pen digging so hard into the paper that it tore through in places, obliterating whatever had been written there. For detectives who had been staring at an empty file for years, these pieces felt like more than just relics. They were physical links to her final weeks, offering glimpses of her state of mind and interactions she hadn't shared with family or friends. But as valuable as they were, the items also deepened the mystery. The DNA in the locket tied the cello directly to Emily, yet none of it proved where she had gone or who she had been with after leaving rehearsal. The handwriting on the sheet music was a tantalizing lead, but without a match in existing records, it was just an unidentified voice from the past. Investigators began the slow process of elimination. Every known associate from the church and school who might have written in her music was quietly asked to provide handwriting samples. Former suspects from the early investigation were revisited, their old statements compared against this new detail. The older bass singer, the delivery driver, even the shy student with the alleged crush, all denied any connection to the music or the diary. None of their handwriting matched, and if someone else had marked the sheet music, there was still the question of how it had ended up inside her cello, hidden so thoroughly it could only be found by dismantling the instrument. The diary entries became a source of quiet obsession among the investigative team. The phrase, "someone knows my songs," was interpreted in different ways. Some thought it meant someone had been listening to her practice in secret. Others believed it referred to the solo piece itself, perhaps suggesting it was meant for someone specific. The line she had erased haunted them most. They had the forensic team test the page for indentations using oblique light and imaging software, but whatever she had written was too deeply damaged to recover. It was as if she had wanted to erase it, not just from sight, but from existence. To the Varner family, the items were both a gift and a wound. They proved that part of Emily's life, her private life, had been hidden from them. They learned she had been afraid to walk home and had not told them. They learned someone else had been part of her music in a way no one had realized. The objects were placed in protective custody, but photographs of them were shown to the family, who confirmed their authenticity and offered any memory that might connect them to a specific person. None of it brought them closer to an answer. When the findings were made public, the town reacted with the same mixture of shock and speculation it had 15 years earlier. Old rumors were dusted off, new theories emerged, and the unanswered question remained the same. Who had been close enough to touch her music, to know her schedule, to hide her possessions in a place where no one would look? The evidence had pulled the case out of dormancy, but it hadn't illuminated the night she vanished. Instead, it had only drawn a sharper outline around the missing hours after rehearsal and the person who had filled them with silence. 15 years after Emily Varner's disappearance, the discovery of her cello and the hidden bundle inside had breathed life into an investigation many thought was beyond saving. Detectives, working through the chain of possibilities with renewed purpose, began retracing the same human paths that had been walked all those years earlier. The strategy was deliberate. Go back to the original suspects, remove doubt where possible, and see what still lingered in the gaps. The first was the fellow student from her high school, the boy once rumored to have had an unreciprocated crush. In the early days of the case, he had been described as awkward, withdrawn, with a tendency to watch Emily from across classrooms or hallways without speaking to her. Some classmates recalled overhearing comments about her that seemed overly intense, even possessive. Back then, his parents had vouched for his whereabouts on the night she disappeared, though the alibi had never been airtight. Now, more than a decade later, he was living several states away, married and working in a field that had nothing to do with music. A voluntary DNA sample was taken to compare against trace evidence collected from the locket and the fabric it had been wrapped in. The results were clear. There was no match. While it didn't prove his innocence in every respect, it closed the door on the idea that he had handled those particular items. The second lead, the choir's older bass singer with a criminal past, could not be questioned. He died in 2014, reportedly from a sudden illness. His name still stirred unease among those who remembered the rumors of friction between him and Emily, but the timeline of his death, coupled with the lack of forensic evidence tying him to the newly discovered items, left the theory in a kind of suspended state, unsatisfying, but practically unworkable. Detectives reviewed his old statements and revisited anyone who might have known him in 2008, yet nothing new emerged. His part in the narrative, if any, was locked in. The past with him. The third was the delivery driver, the man whose route had placed him near St. Augustine's church on the night Emily vanished. He still lived in the same small house on the edge of town, still worked odd jobs, and still refused to speak about the case beyond the original statement he'd given years ago. His route logs had always been vague enough to leave open windows of unaccounted time, and his explanation for being in the vicinity had never fully aligned with what investigators considered typical for his work. Detectives approached him again, hoping the weight of new evidence might prompt him to elaborate, but he declined, repeating only that he had nothing to do with that girl and nothing to add. Without a warrant, there was little they could compel from him, and without new evidence directly linking him to the cello or its contents, his status remained frustratingly unchanged, neither cleared nor confirmable. It was during this process of re-examining past suspects that an analyst in the department took a different angle. The handwriting on Emily's sheet music had been a sticking point, its origin unknown. Every suspect from the early investigation had been checked against it with no result. The analyst began combing through old church records, membership lists, sign-in sheets, and, crucially, archived choir and staff applications. In one of the storage boxes, buried beneath unrelated files, she found an employment application from 2007 belonging to the church's former custodian. The looping, deliberate handwriting on the form was not identical to the annotations in Emily's music, but when compared side by side, certain letter formations were nearly indistinguishable. The capital G's, the slant of the lowercase t, even the way numbers were written, these details suggested the same hand. The custodian's name had never surfaced in the original investigation. There was no record of him being questioned, and no one had flagged him as suspicious at the time. Yet his employment records showed something troubling. He had abruptly resigned from his position just weeks after Emily vanished. There was no stated reason beyond a short note that read, "Personal matters." No forwarding address had been kept on file. It was as if he had walked away from the job and from the town at the same time. When detectives began asking around, older church members remembered him as quiet but polite, someone who worked odd hours and often stayed late to lock up after evening events. A few recalled seeing him around the choir loft or practice rooms, moving equipment or cleaning. The music director admitted that in those days, the custodian had access to all storage areas, including the basement where the cello was eventually found. That fact, combined with the handwriting similarity, reframed the timeline. If the cello had been hidden intentionally, he would have been among the few with both the keys and the opportunity to do it unnoticed. The news spread quickly, and with it, a surge of anger from the community. Many couldn't understand how someone connected to the church, someone with such access, had never been formally interviewed in the early days. For Emily's family, it was a reopening of wounds they had barely learned to live with. They wanted answers to questions that now felt obvious. Where had he gone? Why had he left so suddenly? And what exactly was his relationship to Emily in those final weeks? Detectives began the process of tracking him down, starting with employment records from other towns, property databases, and driver's license renewals. His name was common enough to produce false leads, but within weeks they had a possible match in another state. They confirmed it was him through a combination of address history and a single utility bill. Reaching out, they found him living in a small rural area, working part-time maintenance jobs, largely keeping to himself. When approached, he did not deny working at St. Augustine's during the time of Emily's disappearance, but claimed to remember little about her beyond seeing her with the big case and always practicing. When asked about the handwriting, he shrugged, saying he sometimes jotted notes for choir members if they left music behind, insisting it was nothing unusual. On the subject of his abrupt resignation, he offered only that it wasn't the right place for me anymore, refusing to elaborate. Without more, detectives couldn't compel him to say more than he chose to, and every answer seemed measured to reveal as little as possible. Still, the match between his handwriting and the annotations was the most concrete development the case had seen in years. It didn't prove guilt, but it pulled him from the margins of obscurity into the center of the conversation. The fact that the cello had remained hidden in a basement he once had unrestricted access to was a coincidence the community was no longer willing to see as innocent. For the first time since the cello's discovery, there was a name and a face to attach to the shadows of Emily's final hours. And whether he was the key to the truth or just another in a long list of dead ends, his sudden reappearance in the investigation ensured that the story of Emily Varner's disappearance would not slip quietly back into silence. The search for the church's former custodian took weeks of quiet legwork, each lead narrowing the trail until detectives found themselves turning off a cracked rural highway into a weather-beaten trailer park. The lot where he lived was unkempt, patches of long grass, a shed leaning to one side, and a faded pickup with a missing tailgate. His trailer was small and dim, with the blinds drawn despite the midday sun. When the knock came, it was slow to be answered. He stepped into the doorway cautiously, older now, with lines etched deep into his face and a gray beard that hadn't been neatly kept in some time. His eyes flickered with guarded recognition when the detectives introduced themselves. He didn't try to deny who he was. He confirmed that he had worked at St. Augustine's Church in 2008, cleaning the sanctuary, maintaining the grounds, and locking up after evening events. His resignation, he claimed, had been the result of church politics and things being run the wrong way. When pressed on whether Emily's disappearance had anything to do with his sudden departure, he shook his head firmly. "I had nothing to do with that girl," he said, his voice low, carrying just enough force to sound like a line he had repeated to himself for years. The conversation shifted to the handwriting found on Emily's sheet music. He didn't deny it. In fact, he admitted that he occasionally wrote small notes for choir members, usually at their request if they forgot something or wanted help marking phrasing. He said Emily had been one of the few young members who took her music seriously, practicing alone in the loft or side rooms when others had already left. He remembered her as polite but quiet, never saying more than she had to. He insisted the annotations were harmless, simply reminders or adjustments she had asked for, though he couldn't recall the specific solo piece in question. Detectives asked about the night she vanished. He claimed the last time he saw her was leaving rehearsal, cello case over her shoulder, heading toward the side door that led to the street. He couldn't remember the exact time, only that he had stayed behind to finish stacking chairs before locking up. They pressed him on whether he had noticed anyone following her or if anyone had lingered in the church after she left. His answer was evasive. He said he didn't pay that much attention and couldn't keep track of everyone's comings and goings. When the subject turned to the cello itself, the room seemed to shift. He stated without hesitation that the instrument had been left in the basement long before she vanished, claiming he remembered moving it there himself months earlier, thinking it was broken or abandoned. According to him, it was already gathering dust when Emily disappeared, suggesting that its presence in the storage room had no connection to the night she walked into the rain and never came home. But when detectives cross-checked this claim with the original reports, there was nothing to confirm it. No record from the initial basement search even mentioned a cello case being there, and several early witnesses recalled seeing Emily carrying her own case on the night she disappeared. The contradiction was stark, but without hard evidence, it was impossible to prove he was lying. Throughout the interview, his answers seemed carefully measured, never outright refusing to respond, but never offering more than the bare minimum. Each time detectives tried to pin down details, he would retreat into vague recollections or claim that it had been too long to remember. His manner wasn't defensive so much as controlled, as if he knew exactly how much he could say without crossing into trouble. The more they asked, the more the conversation felt like walking in circles, the core of the truth just out of reach. They asked why, if the cello had been there all along, he hadn't mentioned it when the police searched the church. He shrugged, saying he assumed it wasn't important. When asked why he hadn't come forward after the disappearance to clarify, he replied that he didn't want to get involved in something that had nothing to do with me. To investigators, it was an answer that only deepened suspicion. If his version was true, it meant the cello had sat untouched for months before anyone thought to hide something inside it. A strange and unlikely scenario, given the way it was found wedged deep behind shelving. As the interview wound on, the detectives became aware that the man was subtly steering the conversation away from himself. He mentioned old disagreements between choir members, hinted that certain people weren't as innocent as they seemed, and suggested that if they looked in the right places, they might find others with more reason to be involved. But when asked for specifics, he backtracked, claiming it was just a feeling and not worth writing down. By the time they left, they had gained little in the way of concrete evidence, but much in terms of atmosphere. The former custodian was a man carrying knowledge he had no interest in sharing, a man whose proximity to Emily's final hours was undeniable, yet whose account remained just detached enough to avoid direct accusation. His handwriting on her private music, his unverified claim about the cello's long-term storage, his ability to move freely in and out of the spaces where her possessions had been, all of it formed a picture that was both damning and incomplete. Back at the station, the interview was dissected frame by frame. Investigators debated whether his evasiveness was the product of guilt or simply the self-protective reflex of someone who had spent years avoiding entanglement in a case that had destroyed reputations. In the absence of a confession or new physical evidence, there was nothing to hold him on. He returned to his quiet life in the trailer park, and the detectives were left with the same haunting reality they had faced for years. The person who might hold the final piece of Emily Varner's story was still out there, living in plain sight, and still choosing silence over truth. When the cello was first carried out of the church basement, it was handled like any fragile artifact from a crime scene. To the public, it was simply a headline, the long-missing instrument of a vanished girl found after 15 years. But to the detectives who had worked the case, and to Emily's family, it was more than an object. It was the first tangible piece of her life to emerge since the night she stepped out of St. Augustine's church and disappeared into the rain. It carried the weight of time, the unspoken question of where it had been and who had put it there, and the chilling possibility that it had been sealed away, not just to store it, but to silence it. Forensic teams were meticulous. The exterior was dusted for prints, though any that had once been there had long since degraded. The metal latches and hinges were swabbed for trace DNA, but the results were inconclusive. Too many years had passed, too much contamination from the basement's damp air. The wood of the cello itself was examined, its strings still taut, its varnish intact despite years in the dark. The most revealing detail came not from the instrument, but from the dust on the case. Analysts compared the layering and density to samples taken from surrounding objects in the basement. Their conclusion was precise enough to carry weight in court. The dust indicated it had been placed in its final position no more than a few weeks after Emily vanished. It was not the abandoned relic the former custodian claimed had sat there for months before she disappeared. That single finding did not prove who had hidden it, but it proved that someone had lied, and it proved that the cello had been deliberately placed, sealed away from view within a narrow window of time, likely when the shock of her disappearance still held the town in its grip, when the church was full of whispered prayers and quiet speculation. Whoever hid it had chosen that moment to move the last object she was known to carry out of sight, a decision that could only have been made by someone with access, opportunity, and motive. The contents of the cello, the locket, the diary pages, the annotated sheet music, spoke to her final days in a voice that was fractured but undeniably hers. The diary hinted at fear without naming its source. It told of a girl who had grown uneasy walking home, who felt watched or known in ways she couldn't explain. It recorded the phrase, "Someone knows my songs," as if it were a code she didn't want anyone else to understand. But beyond those fragments, it offered no clear direction. There was no name, no location, no direct accusation. It was enough to suggest that her disappearance had roots in her personal life, but not enough to name the hand that had pulled her out of it. Detectives pursued every angle the new evidence allowed. The handwriting on the music was run through advanced recognition software, compared not only to past suspects, but to anyone connected to the church in those years. Only the former custodian's samples bore enough similarity to merit further scrutiny. He had already admitted to writing on her music, framing it as an innocent act of assistance, but the forensic dust analysis now contradicted his claim about the cello's history. Still, without a confession, the circumstantial weight wasn't enough to charge him. The locket's DNA confirmed Emily had worn it, but it could not say who had placed it inside the instrument. The timeline placed the cello's concealment in the weeks after her disappearance, but the basement had been accessible to more than one person during that period. The absence of a body left the case legally adrift. Without proof of death, without definitive physical evidence linking a suspect to a crime, it could not move from cold case to prosecution. Theories remained, some sharpened by the new findings, others fading as their flaws were exposed. One camp of investigators believed the custodian was the last person to see her alive, and had used his access to hide both the cello and its contents. Another believed the instrument had been planted in the basement later, by someone else entirely, to frame him or to bury their own connection. For Emily's parents, the evidence was both a breakthrough and a wound. When detectives brought them the news of the cello, they were shown photographs first, then the instrument itself. It was exactly as they remembered, every scratch and polish mark in place. They knew instantly it was hers. They were allowed to hold it briefly, under the watch of the evidence technician. For her mother, the feel of the smooth wood was like holding her daughter's absence in physical form. For her father, the weight of it confirmed what he had always believed, that Emily had not simply walked away from her life. The cello had been with her, and then it had been hidden. That was not the act of a runaway. They chose to believe the cello had come back to them for a reason, not because it would solve the case outright, but because it had survived. It had carried with it pieces of her life that might otherwise have been lost forever. Her words, her photograph, the music she had been working on. They took comfort, however fragile, in the idea that these things had not been destroyed. To them, the cello was a final connection to their daughter, a vessel that had held her voice in the only way it could after she was gone. In the months following the discovery, the case drew national attention again. True crime programs covered it, online forums dissected every detail of the forensic findings, and local reporters revisited interviews from 2008, looking for inconsistencies that might now carry new meaning. Public opinion was divided. Some were convinced the custodian's contradictions were enough to mark him guilty in the court of common sense. Others saw him as a convenient scapegoat in a case still riddled with holes. Detectives kept their focus on the small certainties the cello had provided. The dust proved it had been hidden within weeks of her disappearance. The diary proved she had been uneasy in the days leading up to it. The annotations proved that someone else had been directly involved in her music. The locket proved she had still been in possession of her most personal belongings shortly before she vanished. Each fact was a fragment, none capable of standing alone, but together they painted the edges of a picture still missing its center. The haunting truth was that the cello's reappearance did not bring the clarity many had hoped for. It brought confirmation of deceit, but not the name of the deceiver. It gave weight to the idea that someone alive still knew exactly what had happened that night, but it stopped short of proving who that person was. It became both evidence and symbol, a sealed vessel that had carried part of Emily's story through 15 years of darkness and delivered it into the light without revealing the full score. In the end, the investigation remained open but unresolved. The cello was stored in an evidence vault, preserved against time, in case one day someone decided to speak or new technology could extract a truth it had so far refused to give up. Emily's parents visited it once more before it was locked away, resting their hands on the case as if to say goodbye to a piece of her all over again. For them, the instrument's return was not closure. It was a reminder that their daughter had existed in flesh and voice, that she had been loved, and that somewhere out there, a living person still carried the burden of knowing where she had gone after stepping out of the church into the rain. The cello had been found. The girl who played it had not. And until that changed, the instrument's silence would remain louder than any song it had ever played. The cello was no longer just an instrument. It had become the one tangible piece of Emily's story to reappear since the night she vanished. Investigators treated it as if it were a time capsule, sealing away the last days of her life. Forensics worked methodically. Dust analysis from the case revealed it had been placed in the basement no more than a few weeks after she disappeared, directly contradicting the custodian's claim that it had been there long before. This meant someone had lied, and had done so at a time when her disappearance was fresh and the church was under scrutiny. The contents, her diary pages, annotated music, and silver locket, were equally telling. The diary captured fear without naming its source, hinting she felt watched and that someone knows my songs. The handwriting on the music wasn't hers, linking it to another person who had access to her personal work. The locket carried her DNA, confirming she had it right before she vanished. Yet, none of it proved what happened after rehearsal that night. Without a body, there was no way to determine whether she had died or been taken elsewhere. The custodian's denials didn't match the physical evidence, but his statements couldn't be disproved beyond doubt. He admitted to making notes on her music, framing it as innocent help. He insisted the cello had been abandoned in the basement months earlier. Investigators knew the dust analysis disproved this, but without an admission or direct evidence, they had no grounds for charges. The case remained circumstantial. For Emily's parents, now older, the cello's return was devastating and comforting in equal measure. They believed it had come back to them for a reason, a final connection to their daughter. It held her voice, her fears, her music, and proof she hadn't simply walked away. They saw it as a vessel that had traveled silently through 15 years, only to emerge when it was needed most. National coverage reignited speculation, with many pointing fingers at the custodian. Others theorized the cello had been planted in the basement to mislead the investigation. Online forums parsed every detail of the handwriting and diary. Police focused on what could be proven. The cello was hidden soon after she vanished. She was in possession of those personal items, and someone alive today still knew the truth. In the end, the cello was locked in the evidence vault, preserved for the day technology or conscience might reveal more. Emily's parents visited it once more, their hands resting on the case as if it were her shoulder. The girl who played it remained missing, and somewhere, the person who knew what happened still walked free. The cello had been found, but its silence was louder than any song it had ever played.